In RPGs, my favorite archetype by far is the Necromancer. So you know when Threadlings were added to Destiny, I was so excited. And for a while, Strand Warlock was very solid, but it's taken a lot of indirect nerfs over the past couple years. But Prismatic still makes it pretty good. Now, I know what you're saying. Threadlings aren't good. Everyone says Threadlings aren't good. I disagree. Threadlings are pretty solid. You can make a lot of them, and they do about 45% of the damage of a ignition, which is really solid. Most importantly is that Threadlings inherit the buffs of whatever caused them. If they're caused by Hatchling on weapons, they will inherit all the buffs of the weapon that caused that. If they're on grenades, you can use Spirit of Verity to double the damage. That makes them incredibly strong, on top of being very numerous. You can make so many Threadlings on Prismatic. You're seeing here. You're shredding through this Room 1 Legend campaign. Very little issues. And on top of this, you can mix in Sever and Unravel and just get damage all over the place. There's something about just turning your enemies into your allies and making minions out of them that I think is just super cool. Even if it's not the best build, it's still very strong. If that sounds good to you, let's get into it. I'm Engineer. So, as typical, here's a quick overview of the build just so you can know what you're getting into. The goal of this is to make as many Threadlings as possible while also boosting their damage. It is generally fantastic for ad control. It'll be okay on bosses, but destroying large groups of enemies is exactly what this is built for, because you will take those enemies and turn them into allies through making more Threadlings. I've tested this up to 15 power level under, so that's probably about the limit for it. There will be an artifact perk that's coming later this episode that I think will set this to a whole different level, but we'll talk about that then. So, pros, ad clear is great. Really solid damage over time as long as there's ads to feed the loop. Pretty decent crowd control just through the sheer volume of Threadlings. On the cons, boss DPS is rough with the general way I've set up this build, but if you have Euphony or a lot of ads, you can actually get pretty great boss damage. You just might need to switch some things up. This is really bad at Transcendence generation. It is fully into the darkness side of Transcendence, and that's kind of okay because Transcendence actually hurts the build mostly because it takes away your Threadling Grenade. And then lastly, flying enemies, man. Like, if there are flying enemies, those Threadlings are useless, and I wish there was a solution to it. If you ever find the last boss of Warlord's Ruin, just put the Threadlings up because they're not going to do much of any good against that boss. So with that in mind though, it's still a very fun build, very strong, and I love the theme of it. Let's talk about our exotic. We are going to be using either Verity's Brow or Spirit of Verity. Both of these are great options. The main factor here is that we are getting the grenade damage boost, and at max stacks this is plus 100% grenade energy, plus 100% grenade damage, which is double. That's amazing. That means that every single one of those Threadlings from your Threadling Grenade will be hitting for 90% of the value of an ignition. Think about it, throwing a grenade that's worth 3 ignitions. It's crazy. On top of this was recently changed to have a meter that decays slowly, and it gives percent grenade energy per second, which is pretty novel in the game and cool. Spirit of Verity keeps all of this, but the percent grenade per second is reduced a little bit. Now, the one thing that Verity's Brow does have exclusively is when you cast a grenade while Death Throes is active, you give allies a buff called Field of Flame, which gives them 10 times grenade regen speed. That's 1,000% grenade regen speed for 5 seconds. And that's really cool, especially with how much you can throw grenades. But because Prismatic has access to exotic class items, you can take Spirit of Verity, get most of the benefits, and pair them with things like Spirit of Endless Light, which is my favorite because it keeps all your abilities looping, or Spirit of Osmiomancy, which will just keep those grenades looping, though in that case I'd maybe just lean towards taking Verity's Brow. And then finally, there's Spirit of Apotheosis, which is really great for boss damage, especially with Euphony. If you don't have these exotics for some reason, Verity's Brow is very easy. It's in the base game. You can get it from any source of exotics. Solipsism is the exotic class item for Warlocks, and this requires the final shape. You need to either do the dual Destiny mission or Xur, or farm Overthrow. Always forget about that one. I want to talk about Threadlings just a little bit more. As you can see in the snip from the Destiny Die Compendium, the base damage is 338, and Ignition or Bolt Discharge is 750. So once again, it's a just about 45% of that damage. And there's a small radius on it, so if there's tightly packed enemies, you might get a few multi-kills. On Warlock, Threadlings can perch. That means they will temporarily store on the Warlock and just kind of float around them. And then as you shoot or do melees, they will hop off and go chase enemies down. As I mentioned before, Threadlings scale based on their source and attribute to that source. So for example, Threadlings from the weapon perk Hatchling inherit all damage bonuses of the weapon. Include your surges, any weapon perks, buffs like Radiant, anything that's boosting the damage of that weapon will apply to the Threadlings from Hatchling, which is really cool. Threadlings from Hatchling also count as weapon kills. There's a Strand hand cannon with subsistence on it, and the Threadlings will continuously proc that subsistence so that you never have to reload as long as they're getting kills. And now Threadlings from Grenade inherit all the grenade damage boosts. They also activate all the grenade-based mods, which is really cool. And then lastly, Threadlings from Needlestorm are actually buffed by Spirit of the Star Eater, so that's another way to get some really strong Threadlings if you want. But that will require you to give up Spirit of Verity on the exotic class item. Last and very important, if Threadlings become perched, they lose all attribution. They no longer count as whatever the original source was. They lose all buffs. So when possible, try and use your Threadlings immediately. Over to our aspects and abilities. These are really straightforward. We take Feed the Void. It heals us every time we get a kill after we get one ability kill to start the loop. And it gives us grenade energy back, which is really great for our gameplay loop. And then we're going to obviously take Weaver's Call, because this generates more Threadlings. It'll generate 3 Threadlings whenever you cast your class ability, and it deploys all perched Threadlings. But the cooler part of it that is new from the final shape is that when you get a kill with any kind of strand damage, you will progress towards generating a perched Threadling. So roughly about every 3 strand damage kills, you will generate an extra Threadling immediately. For your super, Needlestorm obviously fits the most. It's Strand, but this is actually flexible. You could take any of the supers. It's a super, so you're not necessarily going to have it up all the time. If you need damage resistance, you might want to take Song of Flame because it lasts forever and gives you 90% damage resistance, which is really good. Your grenade absolutely should be Threadling Grenade. For your melee, I like Arcane Needle just because we get 3 charges of it and we can spread some Unravel. Lastly, on your class ability, this is flexible, but I really like Phoenix Dive for the short cooldown. Keeps that Inmost Light ability loop going really well, and it lets you get that first effect on Weaver's Call more often. On our fragments, we're going to take balance for more ability spam. You get grenade energy when you get rapid dark kills, and that is all we do. We would take Facet of Hope for class ability regen. That just keeps the ability loop going, and we'll have an elemental buff and Devour up pretty much constantly. Take Facet of Dawn to gain Radiant, which is a 20% weapon damage boost for 5 seconds on a powered melee hit. This is going to boost the damage of our weapon that has Hatchling on it. So that's great free Threadling damage boost. So that will very easily boost the damage of the Threadlings that our weapons make. I'm going to recommend Facet of Solitude. We don't have a lot of sources of damage resistance in this build, so debuffing enemies by 40% is great, and we can get that even stronger thanks to the artifact. Lastly, I recommend Facet of Protection. It is straight 15% damage resistance when surrounded, which is really helpful. Now for some alternates, you can take Facet of Purpose to give more damage reduction. I don't recommend this with Needlestorm though, because while Woven Mail is really good, it's 45% damage resistance, it only lasts for 5 seconds on orb pickup, and that's just not enough to have great uptime. If you're using one of the other supers, that might be fine. With Needlestorm, I don't necessarily recommend it. Now, another fragment that might be good for this is using Facet of Mending, because then you will get Cure 1 every time you get a grenade Final Blow, which happens pretty frequently. So just something to consider. On our mods and armor stats, it's pretty straightforward. We're building for orbs and super energy. So we have hands-on and ashes to assets on the helmet. And then we have a harmonic siphon or a strand siphon, firepower and reaper across our build. And then we're really just going to build for weapon damage and reload. So we have a harmonic loader, and then we have 3 strand weapon surges because we have our healing covered on Devour, and that just lets our weapon work as good as possible. On top of that too, because you take weapon surges, you need time dilation on your class items so that those armor charges last longer. For the stats, it's the standard priority. Max out resilience, max out discipline, get as much recovery and strength as you can get, and then just get intellect to 30. And that's it. Briefly talking about the artifact mods, we have some really good strand ones this episode. We have Unraveling Orbs so that we can get Unravel up anytime we pick up an Orb of Power if we're using a strand weapon, which we plan to do a lot. Over in column 3, we have Hold the Line, which is a really solid machine gun artifact perk, and there's a good machine gun that goes with this build. Very importantly, in column 3 though, we have Disruptor Spike, which makes exhaustion go from 10% decreased damage to 12.5% decreased damage, and it makes Sever go from 40% decreased damage to 52% decreased damage. So that is enemies doing half the damage they do as long as you can sever them, which we'll do frequently. Now, in column 4, we have a perk that really helps this out, and that is Horde Shuttle. So when an enemy is unraveled and you deal enough damage to him, it spawns a free Threadling with a half-second cooldown, which is crazy. But really important here is that not currently, but later this episode sometime, we'll get a boost to that makes all Threadlings inflict Sever. It means every single enemy attacked by a Threadling will deal potentially 52% less damage thanks to Disruptor Spike. That's insane, and is going to make Threadling builds so good. Lastly, in column 5, we have Elemental Supercharger, which will give us super energy much faster when killing exhausted or severed enemies, which as you can see is just going to synergize really well here. And we have Heavy Ordnance Regeneration. So when you deal damage with machine guns or rocket launchers, it will give you damage resistance and give you grenade and melee ability regen, which is really cool. And once again, makes machine guns make a lot of sense here. Now, weapons. This is a very large part of this build, so I've listed a lot of weapons here. I won't cover all of them in detail because of that, but the important thing is that in your Strand slot, you want a Hatchling primary, and you ideally want something that can hit critical hits. Hatchling does generate Threadlings on multi-kills, but it will always generate them on a precision kill, so something with precision is good. That's why you will see a lot of hand cannons here. The absolute best one here is Unloved from the new Sundered Doctrine. This is a 2-round burst hand cannon, and the reason this is the best is because it can roll Hatchling in the 3rd column, which means you can pair it with Frenzy in the 4th column, or Elemental Honing, which is a stronger buff, but leaves the reload bad. Frenzy maxes out the reload speed while it's active and gives you 15% more damage, which is great. I love this gun. I was so blessed with this roll, and it's what inspired this whole build, so definitely get out there and farm that. The dungeon's really cool too. Another thing on top of this too is the origin trait for this weapon. When you shoot strong enemies, it will exhaust them so that you can get exhaustion and sever up on the same enemy very easily. And another thing too with Facet of Isolation, because this is a hand cannon, it only requires 4 precision hits to trigger the sever effect, and you can do that in 2 bursts with this, which is really good. So all around amazing weapon. If you manage to get this roll, it will make this build just go much wilder. Now for other options, Round Robin from Neomuna can roll Subsistence and Hatchling, which is a really effective combo. It's a 120 RPM hand cannon, but with that subsistence, you don't really notice the negatives of that reload as much. You can also get better devils from Crucible. I like this with either Slice or Demolitionist in Hatchling. The Slice roll is also pretty good for getting Sever without having to get those precision hits. Ice's Care from Trials is a heavy burst pulse rifle. Get that with Slice or Keep Away in Hatchling, which is really good if you're enjoying that Trials rework. And then Rufus's Fury is our probably best crafted option. This is from Root of Nightmares, but you can get it with Demolitionist and Hatchling. Lastly, not a primary, but it's worth mentioning Euphony, which is the Salvation's Edge exotic. This is a linear fusion rifle that when you score hits on enemies will just spit out more Threadlings, and then as Threadlings deal damage, it will get a damage boost. It's very effective for boss DPS. It's a very fun gun, but the ammo economy is a bit rough. But I don't want to build completely around this because it's from Salvation's Edge, which is one of the least run raids, and its raid exotics are sometimes difficult to get. Definitely something to keep in mind though for boss DPS. On your energy slot, if you want to go fully Strand, you can take Tessellation, which will give you Strand in all 3 weapon slots, and it's a really solid fusion rifle. Otherwise, Aerodenial GLs or Rocket Sidearms are really good pairing. It gives you some extra damage. The Aerodenial GLs are kind of fire and forget, but you can get things like Bolt Charge or Volatility, or just make a lot of orbs with like VS Velocity Baton. The arc version of this is Psychopomp, which is new this episode, but very good weapon. In the heavy slot, your best option for general play is Memoria, because this can also roll Hatchling and Frenzy, just like Unloved. This is a really solid machine gun, it's great, and that Frenzy is going to kind of cover for the reload. If you want some other heavy options, you can take Scintillation. While there are Hatchling rolls for this, you probably want something like an Envious Assassin and Bait and Switch or Firing Line. and this is more for boss DPS phases where you can land critical hits. If you want a heavy weapon that just focuses all in on clearing enemies, the Carax's Distress from Root of Nightmares is a grenade launcher with chain reaction and hatchling, which is really fun. It's a pretty solid weapon. Just want to talk a little bit about how the damage boosting works. If you're not aware, damage buffs stack multiplicatively, so you just multiply them and get the net factor. So on weapons, we can generally stack Radiant, Frenzy, Weapon Surge ×3, and Transcendence if you have that up. Though keep in mind that Transcendence will lock out your Threadling Grenades, and all that comes out to usually somewhere between 40 to 77% damage boost. 40% would be what it is if a Radiant and Transcendence are down, so just Frenzy and Weapon Surge. But that's still pretty respectable. Now on the grenade side, it's all about Spirit of Verity. You'll get somewhere between 40 to 100% increased grenade damage, which is still very good. But it's pretty easy to keep those stacks high enough to get like 60 to 80%. And as mentioned earlier, at max Verity stacks, every Threadling from your Threadling Grenade, it's for 90% of an ignition, which is really strong. Now, I want to do a little bit of a longer gameplay demo. If you've seen some of my other videos, I keep using this because I haven't found anything that's quite better, but this is the opening of Contest of Elders. It's hectic. It is, I think it's up to 20-30 power level this episode, so it could be a little bit challenging. I purposefully kind of pushed my power level a little bit lower here, so I'm like a little over 10 power levels under. You can see we're just getting swarmed by my least favorite faction for this, the Dread. So I've got Grim shooting at me left and right. Devour's doing a lot of work here. Faceted Protection is doing a lot of work here because we were constantly surrounded. Frenzy's keeping that reload on the weapon good, but you just hammer through the enemies and just the Threadlings will pop off and attack them. I mentioned earlier Threadlings aren't good against flying enemies, but they actually do okay against Grim when they fly low. If they start jumping up way into the air, it's nothing. But most of these kind of hang near the ground, and that is enough. As with most Devour-based builds, the key is to just keep killing. If you get low on health, the best thing you can do is to finish an enemy off. You will tend to make a lot of tangles in this build. It's great extra damage if you can shoot them, but not going to do that much for you. Once again, just make sure you keep those abilities looping. I could be even using my abilities a little bit more, but I'm being a little careful just so I don't run out and that I have Phoenix Dive in a pinch. Having Threadlings on the field is kind of nice for Devour because a lot of times while you're fighting other things, they're out hunting something else and giving you a free heal. It really kind of feels that Necromancer fantasy where you are feeding your enemies and consuming their energy to stay alive and just keep fighting. So I've always just thought that was really cool. Boss here is out. It is a giant Taken Captain, which is annoying. There are some Threadlings at the enemies that are further away. Set them with some AoE. Get yelled at by some bats. Get blinded by the Taken Captain, but let's get we're hanging in there. Just throwing some Threadlings out and then just trying to get Sever up on that boss. Yeah, so just land a few precision hits and boom. Damage output dropped by 50%, which makes a lot of things more manageable. Then just when you're fighting a boss like this, just on cooldown, use every Threadling ability you have just to keep them tucked in, and just keep applying Sever. Machine guns are also really good for this. You can see that reload is barely noticeable thanks to Frenzy. Roll them down. Just getting those precision hits to reproc Sever. And boom, finish them off the melee. So, just going over that gameplay loop and added clear, just cycle your abilities constantly and fill in with as much weapon damage and kills as you can get. For large targets, hit them with precision hits to Sever, and then just use your super for either added clear bosses. Just briefly, if you are going to use Euphony, cast your super, then use as many abilities as you can while stacking your shots. You just want to get as many Threadlings out there to get the buff up to 20 stacks. Consider Spirit of Apotheosis. This gives you insane grenade and melee regen for a little bit after you use your super, and it makes it really easy to get to max stacks on Euphony. Once you're completely out of abilities and grenades, then you can pop Transcendence because it won't necessarily hurt that setup, and it gives you 5% damage boost and a damage resistance, and then just unload until you run out of ammo, and then switch to something else. So really solid, and that's pretty much it for the gameplay loop. Yeah, just to wrap up, I'm coming back to the build review tab just so you can kind of think about all the things we talked about, just including. I hope you found that fun. I really like this build. I've always liked it, and it's feeling pretty good, especially with a little bit of artifact support from this episode, but it's still generally pretty solid. I've used it pretty much every episode, at least a little bit, just because it's one of my favorite builds to come back to. In terms of the channel growth has been great lately. I really appreciate all the support and all the new subscribers. More subscribers help me out so that I can get some of YouTube's money instead of them just taking it all. I've recently passed the threshold where you can now become a member of my channel. If you are interested in that, feel free to join, and you'll get a few small perks, and I will generally focus on your stuff first. But the main thing that I'm offering is that if you become a member, I will have a monthly poll for members to pick a build that I will develop in my typical level of detail. So if you want some help with builds or just want to support the channel, feel free to do that. I would appreciate it. And with that, I'll let you go. Thanks for all the support and have a good one.